The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most strategically vital choke points. Located between Iran and Oman, this narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf with the Arabian Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. Roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, with a 2-mile shipping lane in each direction, the strait is the maritime lifeline for the world's major oil producers in the Gulf region, namely Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar. As of 2024, about 22 million barrels of oil per day, around 20% of the global oil supply, passes through the strait. Consequently, any disruption or closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran would trigger a global crisis with far-reaching economic, political, and military consequences. If Iran were to close the Strait of Hormuz, the immediate consequence would be a spike in global oil prices. Given the strait's role in transporting 1/5 of the world's oil, even rumors of closure have historically resulted in price volatility. A real and prolonged shutdown could see oil prices doubling or tripling, easily surpassing $150 per barrel, potentially even reaching $200 in the worst-case scenario. A sudden energy shock of this magnitude would trigger supply chain disruptions, increase transportation and manufacturing costs, and fuel inflation globally. Developed economies, already burdened with inflationary pressures or interest rate concerns, would be forced into emergency economic measures, potentially triggering a global recession. Developing countries, especially those heavily reliant on oil imports, would face balance of payment crises, food insecurity, and social unrest. Gulf states have invested in pipelines bypassing the strait, such as the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia and the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline in the UAE. But these alternatives cannot match the capacity or efficiency of Hormuz. Combined, they can carry only about 6 to 7 million barrels per day, far short of the demand. This means the strategic vulnerability remains acute, especially for countries like Iraq and Qatar, which have no viable bypass routes. Iran has threatened to close the strait multiple times, often in response to U.S. sanctions or perceived military threats. The Islamic Republic views this choke point as a trump card, a last resort deterrent. However, actually closing the strait would represent a declaration of hostilities, crossing a line that could unite its adversaries. Internally, such a move would reflect desperation, perhaps in the face of crippling sanctions, political isolation, or an existential threat to the regime. Domestically, the Iranian leadership could use the crisis to rally nationalist sentiment, silence opposition, and justify emergency governance. But it would also risk internal unrest, especially if retaliatory strikes follow or if sanctions tighten further, crushing the already strained economy. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, is tasked with ensuring maritime security in the region. A closure of the Strait of Hormuz would almost certainly provoke a military response from the United States. This could range from naval blockades, airstrikes, cyber operations, or even direct attacks on Iranian missile and naval assets. NATO allies and Gulf Cooperation Council states would likely support U.S. efforts, whether openly or covertly. A wider conflict could ensue, especially if Iran retaliates against U.S. bases in Iraq, the UAE, or Bahrain, or if Hezbollah opens another front in Lebanon. Israel would perceive the closure as a direct threat, especially if it is linked to Iranian nuclear escalation or proxy mobilization. Tel Aviv may use the occasion to strike Iranian nuclear or military facilities, prompting a broader regional war. The Iran-Israel shadow war could become a direct confrontation, destabilizing the entire Middle East. China, which imports nearly 40% of its oil from the Gulf, would view the closure as a strategic nightmare. Beijing might use diplomatic leverage to de-escalate tensions and propose international mediation, but it could also consider deploying naval forces to protect its maritime routes, marking a dramatic shift in its global security posture. Russia, already at odds with the West, might exploit the crisis. Moscow would benefit economically from rising oil prices and could support Iran diplomatically, but it would be careful not to be drawn directly into conflict. A prolonged crisis would also distract Western powers from the war in Ukraine, a possible bonus for Russia. On the other hand, the Asian energy-dependent economies would face immediate challenges. India gets over 80% of its oil through Hormuz, while Japan and South Korea also rely heavily on Gulf imports. They would likely lobby the UN for swift international intervention and diversify energy sources, a difficult task in the short term. Economically, they would suffer from inflation, trade disruption, and political backlash from domestic populations. The Strait of Hormuz is governed by the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guarantees the right of transit passage through international straits. Iran's full closure would constitute a violation of international law, triggering UN Security Council deliberations, although Iran has not ratified it. However, due to the veto powers of Russia and China, any resolution mandating forceful action could be blocked, leading to unilateral action by coalitions of willing states. The closure would provoke an emergency meeting of the G7, OPEC+, and UN Security Council. Diplomatic channels, particularly through neutral countries like Oman, Switzerland, or Qatar, would become vital. While Iran might demand the lifting of sanctions or security guarantees in exchange for reopening the strait, the West would resist any form of hostage diplomacy. The potential for a miscalculation in such a high-stakes environment is immense. A skirmish in the Persian Gulf could escalate into a regional war involving Israel, the US, Iran, and proxy forces across Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. The Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and Eastern Mediterranean could become secondary theaters of conflict. Cyber warfare, drone strikes, and oil infrastructure sabotage also could intensify, affecting Saudi Aramco, Qatari LNG facilities, and UAE shipping lanes. The region's security architecture, already fragile, would be tested to the brink. One silver lining to such a crisis could be the acceleration of global efforts toward energy diversification. Europe, already pursuing independence from Russian gas, would double down on green energy, nuclear power, and LNG imports from more stable partners like the US, Australia, or East Africa. The crisis could also foster the emergence of new maritime coalitions, such as a Gulf Security Forum involving India, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and Gulf states to safeguard freedom of navigation. NATO might extend partnerships with Gulf monarchies, offering naval guarantees in exchange for deeper security cooperation. Shortly, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran would be a catastrophic geopolitical move, with consequences rippling far beyond the Gulf region. While it may appear as a lever of last resort in Tehran's strategic playbook, the economic blowback, military retaliation, and diplomatic isolation that would follow may prove unsustainable for Iran. For the rest of the world, such a crisis would serve as a reminder of how fragile the global economy remains, tied as it is to a 21-mile strait in a volatile region. Preventing this scenario requires not only deterrence and preparedness, but also proactive diplomacy, redundant infrastructure, and a serious commitment to energy resilience in an era where chokepoints can dictate the fate of nations.